unpack this. Picture the scene. It's just after 10:20 p.m., September 18th, 1931. Rural, dark, outside Xinyang, China. There's this small explosion along a railway track.
Right.
Our sources suggest it was actually pretty minor, almost insignificant, really, in terms of physical damage.
Yeah, a train apparently passed over it soon after, no problem.
Exactly. Yet this wasn't just some random thing. This tiny event, according to the material you've shared, was the calculated trigger, the spark for a massive military expansion.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how something so, well, deliberately small could be used as the pretext for something so huge. It really points, like you said, to a plan already being in motion.
Totally. So today we're doing a deep dive into that precise moment known as the Luqiaohu incident and how it was immediately seized upon, escalated into the Mukden incident.
And the whole tangled history behind it, what the sources call the Manchuria-Mongolia problem.
Right. Our mission here is to pull out the essential nuggets, the key insights from your sources. We'll look at the historical context, the incident itself, how the sources say it really happened.
The rapid military escalation that followed.
The really complex, often contradictory reactions from Japan, China, the international community.
And ultimately, what it all led to. The creation of a whole new state and Japan basically walking off the global stage.
Think of this deep dive as your shortcut to understanding not just what happened, but the why. Connecting the dots between these long-standing issues, the political maneuvering, military ambition, and how the world reacted or didn't react effectively.
It's about linking those strategic theories floating around in Tokyo with the actions of soldiers on the ground in Manchuria.
Okay, so to understand the spark, we really need to set the stage first. Let's dive into what your sources lay out about this Manchuria-Mongolia problem.
Right. So the sources frame the Manchuria-Mongolia problem as this really intricate web of issues. Conflicts arising from Japan basically asserting special rights and interests in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia.
And this wasn't just out of the blue, right? It had roots.
Oh, definitely not out of the blue. It largely stemmed from the concessions Japan gained after winning the Russo-Japanese War back in 1904-1905.
Okay, and what kind of concessions are we talking about, according to the sources?
Well, the Treaty of Portsmouth was absolutely key. It handed Japan control over the southern section of the Chinese Eastern Railway.
The SMR, the South Manchuria Railway.
Exactly, the SMR. The crucial part from Changshan down to Dalian. Plus, they got leased territories, like the Kwantung leased territory, and important coal mining rights.
Okay.
And then subsequent agreements with both Russia and China kind of solidified these specific Japanese economic and strategic footholds. It wasn't just about business. Controlling that railway was seen as vital for access, resources, projecting power.
But things were changing in China itself. The sources talk a lot about rising Chinese nationalism.
Absolutely critical context there. You have the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912, then the rise of the Kuomintang government under Chiang Kai-shek in the 1920s. And with that came this really powerful national recovery movement. This movement, as your sources highlight, directly challenged those existing Japanese rights and presence in Manchuria. China saw them as, well, infringements on its sovereignty.
So that's the core friction point.
That's the core friction. Entrenched Japanese interests bumping up against a resurgent China, trying to assert its control over its own territory.
So by the late 1920s, this clash is brewing.
Mm-hmm.
How did Japan itself grapple with this? Because your sources show some really different approaches within Japan around 1928. The internal tensions were really building.
Yeah, that's where it gets really complicated. The sources describe these distinct, often clashing viewpoints. On one hand, you had the Manchuria-Mongolia special region theory. This was associated with Prime Minister Tanaka Jichi.
Okay.
His approach basically accepted Kuomintang rule over the rest of China, but aimed to maintain Japanese influence in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia by working with the local Chinese warlords who controlled the region, like Zhang Zulin.
Okay. So influence through cooperation with the existing local power structure there.
Precisely. Then you had the cooperative diplomacy approach. People like Foreign Minister Shidehara Kijuru were pushing this.
Shidehara diplomacy, right?
Yeah. This view was more, let's say, pragmatic. It accepted the potential unification of all of China, including Manchuria and Mongolia, under the Kuomintang. The goal there was friendly relations, economic exchange. They believed Japan's interests could be secured through diplomacy and trade within a unified China.
Seems like a more conventional diplomatic path.
Or then
The military. They had their own more forceful ideas, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. The Kwantung Army, that's Japan's garrison force stationed right there in Manchuria,
Yep.
they had what the sources call a Manchuria separation policy.
Separation, okay.
Now, The initial stated goal here, as the sources note, was kind of nuanced. They wanted to create a new regime under Japanese control, but they initially framed this within sort of assumed continued Chinese sovereignty. Well, possibly to simplify things diplomatically, to deal with tricky issues like railway rights or business disputes without immediately triggering a full sovereignty crisis. They wanted a new reality on the ground, Japanese-controlled, but maybe were willing to keep up appearances nominally at first.
Okay, so like a de facto Japanese state, but maybe not a formal break from China right away.
That seems to have been one layer of thinking. But your sources also point to even more radical elements within the military. Factions like the Mokukai and the Isekikai, they were pushing a Manchuria-Mongolia possession policy.
Possession. That sounds much more direct.
It was. This group sought substantial possession of the territory. They argued it was absolutely essential for Japan's strategic needs, things like total national mobilization for potential future wars, especially, with the Soviet Union looming.
Right.
And this view completely denied Chinese sovereignty over the region. It wasn't about influence within China, it was about taking it. And what's crucial here, as the sources really emphasize, is how these wildly different ideas, from working within Chinese sovereignty to separating but keeping up appearances to outright possession, all existed and competed inside Japan at the same time.
That internal division is so key, and your sources make a really strong link between these growing ambitions and the economic pressures Japan was facing.
Yes, they absolutely highlight the impact of the Great Depression, which kicked off in 1929. Japan was already struggling economically. You had the Showa Depression, the agricultural crisis.
Right.
And the idea that losing their interest in Manchuria would be a national disaster really gained traction. Manchuria, with its resources, its potential as a market, was increasingly framed as Japan's economic lifeline.
Which must have fueled public support for a more aggressive stance.
Exactly. But here's a really key insight from the sources. While the Depression definitely made things worse, it created this sense of urgent crisis. The plan by certain military factions to actually seize control of Manchuria, that wasn't created by the Depression. Those plans existed before the economic downturn. The Depression, the sources seem to suggest, became a kind of favorable opportunity. It allowed those within the military who already had these radical plans to push their agenda forward, giving them more leverage, with the public and politicians.
So the economic crisis was more of an accelerant, maybe, than the root cause of the most radical plans.
That seems to be the argument, yeah.
Okay, so on top of the economic woes and these internal debates, your sources list some specific incidents that really cranked up the tension and public anger in the years and months right before September 1931.
They do. Several events really built up that tinderbox atmosphere. You had the Nakamura incident in June 1931. A Japanese army captain was killed by Chinese soldiers.
Okay.
This was played up hugely in Japan as an outrage, demanding strong action. But the fact that the officer was actually on a clandestine espionage mission, that part was largely kept quiet from the Japanese public.
Creating a narrative of victimhood to justify whatever might come next.
Pretty much. Then there was the Wanpaoshan incident in July, a dispute between Korean farmers, who were Japanese subjects, and local Chinese farmers. It tragically escalated into anti-Chinese riots back in Korea, which further inflamed ethnic tensions everywhere.
Right.
And critically, you had increasing anti-Japanese activities happening inside Manchuria itself, driven by that rising Chinese nationalism we talked about.
Like what?
Well, the sources mention things like China building new railway lines parallel to Japan's South Manchuria Railway, directly threatening its profits, and new mining laws designed to restrict Japanese businesses. It all fed into this narrative, publicly pushed by figures like Yusuke Matsuoka, that Manchuria was absolutely vital Japan's lifeline.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing, conflicting ambitions in Japan, economic desperation, rising nationalism on both sides, a series of really inflammatory incidents. And then, the night of September 18th, 1931, near Luqiaohu, that tinderbox was intentionally lit.
That's the absolute crucial point the sources drive home, the explosion that night. It was not an attack started by the Chinese military. It was, as your sources state really clearly, a pre-planned conspiracy, a self-staged event, a false flag operation.
Orchestrated by who? Within the Kwantung Army.
By specific elements within the Kwantung Army, yes.
And your sources actually name the individuals behind this.
They do. They identify Lieutenant Colonel Kanji Ishihara and Colonel Seishiro Itagaki. Both were influential staff officers in the Kwanton Army, key members of that radical Iskikai faction we mentioned earlier. They were the masterminds.
Ishihara and Itagaki.
Right. And the actual bombing of the railway line. That was carried out by a small group of soldiers led by Lieutenant Sumori Kawamoto. The plan was audacious. It's simple. Create an incident, blame the Chinese, and use that as the justification for the military action they already wanted to take.
And the sources really emphasize just how small the actual explosion was, not some huge attack.
That's a key detail the sources highlight again and again. The damage was minimal, described as only about 80 centimeters of one rail, plus a couple of railway sleepers.
Tiny.
Yeah. And the fact that a train passed over the spot without derailing shortly after the explosion really tells you the scale. Some theories from the sources even suggest the main goal might have just been the sound of the explosion. A signal, maybe, rather than significant damage.
A deliberate, minimal act designed purely to ignite a pre-planned major response.
Exactly. And there was even some initial confusion sown about the exact location. Itagaki reportedly used a slightly different name, Ryushu, when talking to some media and officials early on.
Interesting. Why?
Maybe another layer of controlling the immediate narrative. Creating a bit of fog before the location officially settled as Lu Chaohu or Majuko in Japanese.
So the spark is lit, the false flag flies. What happened right after that? Your sources describe an incredibly rapid escalation. The Mukden incident really unfolds now.
Immediately. Right after the explosion, around 10:30 p.m., the Kwanton Army launched its planned assault. Claiming they were responding to a Chinese attack on the railway, the one they just staged themselves, they attacked the nearby Chinese barracks at Beiding.
And the Chinese response here is crucial, isn't it? Your sources mentioned Zhang Zuiliang's no resistance policy.
Absolutely pivotal factor. Zhang Zuiliang, the warlord effectively controlling Manchuria, who was aligned with the nationalists, he had indeed ordered his troops to avoid a direct military clash with the Japanese, to adopt a no resistance policy.
Why did he do that?
Well, according to the sources, it seems to be a mix of things. Prioritizing domestic issues for the central Kuomintang government, they were dealing with huge floods that summer, internal conflicts, and also maybe a belief or hope that international opinion, particularly the League of Nations, would step in and protect China's sovereignty if they didn't escalate.
So even though they were attacked, many Chinese units just held back.
Yes. While there was some limited localized resistance from some Chinese soldiers right at the start, they largely followed Zhang's orders and withdrew. The casualty figures highlighted in the sources really tell that story.
What were they?
Minimal Japanese casualties at Beiding, like 2 killed, 22 wounded, contrasted very sharply with hundreds of Chinese casualties at those barracks. This lack of strong, organized resistance basically allowed the Japanese military to achieve its immediate goals with brutal speed and efficiency.
And they didn't stop there. They expanded control rapidly.
Not at all. The Kwanton Army moved incredibly fast. Within about 24 hours, so by September 19th, they had occupied Fengtian City Center, that's Mukden and major cities, all along the South Manchuria Railway line in southern Manchuria. Places like Changchun.
Though there was more resistance in Changchun.
Yes, the sources note they faced more significant resistance there, which led to higher Japanese casualties, maybe 66 killed, 79 wounded before they finally took the city. But the ambition wasn't just about controlling these few cities.
No, your sources show the military pushing for a much wider takeover almost immediately.
That's right. General Shigeru Honjo, the commander of the Kwanton Army, wasn't satisfied with just southern Manchuria. On September 19th, the very next day, he telegraphed Army Central back in Tokyo. He argued for securing the entirety of Manchuria and actually requested additional divisions be sent.
All right.
And that, according to the sources, is really the moment the incident shifts. It becomes a large-scale military operation aimed at total control, moving way beyond any believable claim of self-defense related to a slightly damaged railway track.
This whole sequence, especially the regional army commanders acting so boldly, so quickly, it seems to perfectly illustrate that key concept your sources highlight. Kikokujo.
It's such a critical lens for understanding this period. Gokukujo, literally the lower dominates the upper. It describes this phenomenon where subordinates or regional branches act independently, sometimes even defying or just completely overriding central authority.
And the Kwantung Army's actions are a prime example.
Yeah, a prime example. Driven by their own strategic vision, their own timetable, their impatience with Tokyo. But it wasn't just the Kwantung Army. The Chosen Army, the Japanese forces stationed in Korea, also played a role in this dynamic.
So, what did they do?
Well, the sources point to a really clear act of insubordination on September 21st. General Sanjuri Hayashi, who commanded the Chosen Army, unilaterally ordered a mixed brigade to cross the border from Korea into Manchuria to support the Kwantung Army.
Without orders from Tokyo.
Without the required formal authorization from the emperor, which was constitutionally necessary for deploying troops outside Japanese territory or its colonies.
So, a direct defiance of central military command and presumably the government's policy at that moment.
Absolutely. Tokyo, as we'll get into, had initially decided on a non-expansion policy. They wanted to contain the incident. Hayashi's order was a clear violation of that. It presented the central government and Army Central back in Tokyo with a fait accompli, a reality created on the ground. It perfectly captures that Gakokujo dynamic. Regional military commands acting on their own initiative, forcing Tokyo's hand, making them react rather than direct.
Okay, let's pivot to those reactions now, starting with the Chinese officials on the ground. Given Zheng's no resistance policy, how did they keep responding after the initial attacks?
The sources indicate that, following Zhang Shuliang's directive, Chinese officials and military reps made repeated attempts to de-escalate. You have figures like Zhang Shi, he was the governor of Liaoning province, and Zhao Xinbo, who was representing Zhang Shuliang. They contacted the Japanese consulate general in Fengqian multiple times on the night of the 18th and the morning of the 19th.
What were they saying?
They explicitly communicated their policy of complete non-resistance and pleaded for the Japanese military to halt their attacks. They were trying to signal very clearly, we are not fighting back.
And how did the Japanese civilian officials on the ground, like the consul general, react to this?
Here the sources highlight this really stark contrast between the diplomat and the military. Consul General Hisajiro Hayashi in Fengqian. He was aware of China's non-resistance. He believed the incident should be handled diplomatically.
Right.
He actually told Colonel Itagaki, one of the architects of the whole thing, remember that in his view, no state of war existed. But Itagaki was completely dismissive.
Of course.
He just insisted the Chinese had attacked first, and the military's policy was retaliation, period. The sources describe Itagaki basically intimidating the consulate general staff, questioning their right to even interfere with military command.
So the consul was trying to pump the brakes.
Yes, and crucially, Consul Hayashi sent these urgent, confidential telegrams back to Tokyo. He expressed his strong suspicions about a Kwantung Army plot and urged restraint from the center. He recognized the military's actions were just driving the situation completely out of control.
So the government in Tokyo starts getting these conflicting reports. The military claiming self-defense, their own diplomat on the ground hinting at a conspiracy. How did the Japanese government and Army Central initially react?
Well, the first reports hit Army Central very early on the 19th. The initial reaction within the Army leadership itself was a bit mixed. Some felt reinforcements were needed, but they were constrained by the government, which wanted to avoid escalation.
Then the cabinet met.
Right, an emergency cabinet meeting on September 19th. Prime Minister Wakatsuki was caught in the middle. Army Minister Minami presented it as a clear case of Chinese aggression, Japanese self-defense. Straightforward.
Sure.
But Foreign Minister Shidahara's report included the information from Consul Hayashi, hinting at a possible Kwantung Army plot. This created, according to the sources, significant skepticism among some cabinet ministers. They weren't just buying the military's story wholesale.
And that meeting resulted in the non-expansion policy.
Yes. The cabinet decided the incident absolutely must not be allowed to expand. They agreed that any further troop deployments would need careful deliberation, approval from the emperor after the cabinet had decided.
Okay.
Army Central then formally instructed both the Kwantung Army and the Chosen Army to stick to this non-expansion policy, and specifically to return their troops to the railway zones, essentially go back to how things were before the 18th.
But your sources note that even within Army Central itself, there was resistance to actually enforcing that order.
Absolutely. That Gikokujo dynamic wasn't just out in Manchuria. Sources indicate that some key staff officers within Army Central, especially in the operations section, actively opposed ordering the Kwantung Army back.
Why?
They felt it would crush military morale, and they prioritized preventing the government from actually enforcing its policy, even if it meant undermining civilian control or even causing the whole cabinet to collapse. They were protecting the military's actions, essentially.
And then came the Chosen Army's move, crossing the border on the 21st, against that policy.
Exactly. A major escalation and a blatant act of defiance against Tokyo's stated non-expansion policy. Prime Minister Wakatsuki and other ministers were reportedly furious.
I bet.
The Army Chief of Staff, Kanaya, even tried to get the emperor's sort of retrospective approval for this unauthorized move, but was apparently advised against it. He ended up having to just report it as a fact and apologize.
So clear insubordination.
Yeah.
The government's angry. What was the actual outcome? Did they force the chosen army back?
This is where you see the military's ability to just create facts on the ground really playing out. On September 22nd, just one day after that unauthorized crossing, and even though the emperor apparently emphasized the non-expansion policy again to Wakatsuki, the cabinet caved.
He approved it.
They retrospectively approved the dispatch of the chosen army brigade and authorized the money needed for it. Your sources quote, Wakatsuki is feeling he'd effectively lost control. He couldn't rein in the military. The government issued a statement on September 24th, trying to limit the damage internationally, denying any intention to grab territory, saying deployments were temporary, but the Kuomintang army just ignored it and kept going.
So the government was losing control.
Increasingly. The sources indicate that, faced with the reality created by the military, plus this surge of hardline opinion back home, the government and even Army Central were cornered. And they began, maybe implicitly at first, accepting the idea of some kind of new regime in Manchuria by late November 1931. The facts on the ground were changing their policy.
What about the Japanese public and the media? How did they react as this was all unfolding?
The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive of the Kuomintang army. Newspapers, radio stations, they covered the incident right away. There's a radio report on September 19th noted as possibly the first ever emergency news bulletin in Japan.
And public opinion?
Strongly backed the military. Public opinion was already, primed by anti-Chinese sentiment, that whole lifeline narrative we discussed. They largely bought the military's story of self-defense and cheered the subsequent actions.
The economic hardship must have played a big role, too. People hoping Manchuria was the answer.
Oh, absolutely. The belief that taking control of Manchuria would provide the economic solutions Japan desperately needed. That resonated powerfully. And your sources also highlight how the media often helped shape this.
How?
By often omitting information that contradicted the official line. Details like China's non-resistance policy or Consul General Hayashi's warnings about a plot, those were often left out of reports, which just fueled the public support for the military. There were a few critical voices, like the magazine Oriental Economist, but they were pretty much drowned out.
Okay, let's shift back to the Chinese side. How did Chiang Kai-shek's strategy evolve beyond that initial no-resistance policy? Did he stick with it?
He largely stuck to his overarching policy of internal pacification before external resistance. That's the phrase. Omei Ring Wai.
Meaning?
Meaning he prioritized consolidating Kuomintang control within China first, dealing with internal challenges, those devastating floods, communist elements, other warlords, rather than committing to a full-scale war with Japan, which he knew China probably wasn't ready for militarily.
So what was his plan regarding Japan?
Instead, as your sources mention, his strategy was to appeal to international justice, to the world community. China formally appealed to the League of Nations on September 21st, 1931. They put their faith in international intervention.
How did the Chinese population react to this combination of Japanese aggression on their soil and their own government's strategy of appealing internationally rather than fighting back immediately?
There was an intense surge of anti-Japanese feeling across China, huge popular anger. This led to widespread calls for resist Japan and save the nation. Kangri Ju Guo.
So protests.
Massive protests, strikes in major cities, and a really significant damaging boycott of Japanese goods. This boycott hit Japanese exports to China hard.
Right.
And the sources suggest that China eventually broke off direct negotiations with Japan, partly because they just didn't believe the government in Tokyo could actually control the Kuomintang army anymore. What's the point of talking to Tokyo if the army in Manchuria was doing its own thing?
That makes sense. So China pins its hopes on the international community, specifically the League of Nations. How did the world respond initially to this rapidly escalating crisis?
Initially, the response from the international community and the League was, well, as your sources describe it, somewhat hesitant, maybe even lenient towards Japan.
What?
Some of the major imperial powers, like Britain and France, reportedly saw Chinese communism and rising Chinese nationalism as potentially greater threats to their own interests. So they were initially more conciliatory towards Japan, perhaps hoping Japan would impose some kind of stability. and the Soviet Union. They adopted a non-interventionist stance. They were focused internally, wary of provoking Japan.
But as the Kwantung Army kept pushing further, occupying more territory, opinion started to shift.
It did. While nobody was talking seriously about sanctions yet, the League did pass a resolution on September 30th. It urged both sides to restore normal relations, invoking Article 11 of the League Covenant. It called on China to protect Japanese lives and property, and crucially, called on Japan to withdraw its troops back to the railway zones, once security was ensured.
Once security was ensured. That sounds like a loophole.
A big one. And here's the critical concession Japan secured, noted in the sources. There was no specified deadline for this withdrawal.
Giving the Kwantung Army valuable time.
Exactly. And they used that time to keep expanding. The bombing of Jinzhou on October 8th is another key incident the sources flag.
What happened there?
It's described as another act of insubordination, apparently by Ishihara again, undertaken without his commander Honju's explicit permission. This involved aerial bombing of a city where Zhang Zuolian was trying to set up a temporary administration. Bombing a civilian area like that particularly damaged Japan's image, especially in Europe.
So the League had to do more.
In response to this continued escalation, yes. The League decided on December 10th, 1931, to send an independent investigative body, the Lytton Commission.
The famous Lytton Commission.
Right. But even here, Japan managed to secure further concessions before agreeing. They got confirmation that they could still take military action against so-called lawless elements, or bandits, in Manchuria, and confirmation that the troop withdrawal deadline remained unspecified. With the commission dispatched, discussion at the League was effectively suspended until the report came back.
What about the United States? Were they involved through the League?
The U.S. wasn't a League member, so they acted independently. Following the Japanese occupation of Jinzhou in early January 1932, the U.S. Secretary of State, Henry Stimson, issued what became known as the Stimson Doctrine.
What did it say?
It declared on January 7th that the United States would not recognize any territorial changes or agreements created by force that violated China's territorial integrity or broke the Kellogg-Briand Pact, that international agreement that outlawed war as a policy tool.
Strong words. Did it have teeth?
Not really. Your sources note that this declaration didn't get full backing from other major powers like the UK. Britain had its own complex interests in China and maybe saw some potential alignment with a stable, even if Japanese-influenced, Manchuria. So they were hesitant to fully endorse non-recognition at that stage.
So bottom line, despite some international condemnation, some formal statements, a commission being sent, the Kwantung Army faced no immediate unified, forceful opposition, and they just kept going.
Precisely. Despite the League investigation starting up, despite their own government's initial, though ineffective, non-expansion policy, the Kwantung Army just pressed forward, both militarily consolidating control and politically laying the groundwork for a new state.
And back in Japan, the political turmoil continued. The government couldn't handle it.
The Wakatsuki cabinet couldn't survive. Their inability to control the military, the escalating international crisis, it all contributed to their collapse in December 1931.
And who took over?
A new government was formed under Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi. Now, Inukai was initially more cautious about recognizing a fully independent Manchuria. Your sources indicate he actually favored a solution that would protect Japanese interests through some kind of local regime, but one that still formally acknowledged Chinese sovereignty. Trying to find a middle ground, perhaps.
But the Kwantung Army wasn't interested in middle grounds by this point. They were already building their state.
Exactly. They were working with cooperative local figures there in Manchuria, moving ahead with their plan. They declared the independence of Manchuria on February 18th, 1932.
Declared independence.
And then on March 9th, 1932, the state of Manchukuo was formally proclaimed. And they installed Puyi, the last emperor of China's Qing dynasty, as its figurehead leader, the chief executive.
This period also saw a really major blow to party politics within Japan itself, didn't it? Something happened in May 32.
It did. The May 15th incident. Prime Minister Inukai, the one who was hesitant about full Manchukuo independence, was assassinated.
Assassinated? By who?
By radicalized young naval officers. They were disillusioned with party politics, perceived corruption, and the government's handling of the London Naval Treaty limitations. Inukai's assassination was a huge shock.
And the impact?
It contributed significantly to the decline of party-based cabinets as the dominant force in Japanese government. It led to the rise of so-called national unity cabinets, like the one formed next under Admiral Makoto Saito. These cabinets were much more influenced by the military and by nationalist public opinion, less beholden to the political parties.
So this new Saito cabinet comes in amidst this political shift, this rising military influence, and they're facing pressure to recognize Manchukuo, the state the military had just created.
Absolutely. They faced intense pressure from the military and also overwhelming public support for recognizing Manchukuo. Both houses of the Japanese Diet passed resolutions urging recognition.
So public opinion was strongly behind it.
Very strongly. And the new foreign minister, Kisai Uchida, made public statements that clearly signaled the government's direction. So Japan formally recognized Manchukuo on September 15th, 1932. They signed the Japan-Manchukuo Protocol, which essentially formalized Japan's control and military presence.
September 15th, 1932. And this recognition happened just weeks before the Lytton Report was finally released.
Critical timing. The Lytton Report was published on October 2nd, 1932.
And what did it find? Did it buy Japan's story?
Not at all. Its findings were really clear. It concluded that Japan's military actions after September 18th were not legitimate self-defense, and that the new state of Manchukuo was not a genuine expression of local independence, but essentially a creation of the Japanese military.
So it called Japan out. What did it recommend?
It proposed a complex solution. It suggested recognizing China's underlying sovereignty over Manchuria, but granting the region really broad autonomy, protecting Japanese interests through new international agreements and oversight, trying to square the circle, basically.
But Japan had already recognized Manchukuo as fully independent.
Exactly. Having already signed that protocol with Manchukuo, Japan found itself in a position where it simply could not accept the Lytton Report's findings or recommendations. Doing so would mean completely reversing its declared policy, admitting the military acted improperly, and dismantling the state they'd just recognized. It was politically impossible by that point.
So Japan rejected the report. And that rejection led directly to Japan's break with the League of Nations.
Directly. The League Assembly debated the report, and on February 24, 1933, it voted to formally adopt its findings, essentially condemning Japan's actions without naming them the aggressor explicitly.
And Japan's reaction.
The Japanese delegation, led by Yusuke Matsuoka, again, the lifeline guy, dramatically walked out of the League Assembly right after the vote.
Walked out.
And then, on March 27, 1933, Japan formally announced its intention to withdraw from the League of Nations entirely, a process that became official 2 years later.
Wow. So that entire chain of events, starting with that tiny staged explosion, through the military's defiance, the government's inability to control them, the creation of this puppet state, the international investigation, and Japan's ultimate rejection of its findings. It led Japan right down this path.
Yeah.
Towards international isolation.
That's the absolutely crucial takeaway from this whole episode. Following its withdrawal from the League, Japan just doubled down, intensified its control and economic exploitation of Manchukuo, and its relations with most of the rest of the world became increasingly strained, increasingly hostile. This period really marks a major acceleration towards Japan's isolation and sets the stage, tragically, for the much larger conflicts still to come in the Pacific.
We've definitely traced a complex path here. We started with that small staged explosion near Luchao, anything but minor in its consequences. We saw how these deep-seated interests and rising nationalisms just collided, how a radical military faction, the Kwantan Army, executed a plan, often overriding their own government, their own central command, that whole Gaokukudo dynamic.
Right.
We saw how China, facing this, put its faith in international intervention.
An intervention that ultimately proved, well, ineffective in stopping Japan,
leading directly to the creation of Manchukuo in Japan, walking away from the League of Nations.
Understanding this specific sequence, the motivations driving different actors in Japan, the specific actions taken, China's really difficult position, the international reaction, it provides absolutely essential context. You can't really understand the path to World War II in Asia without grasping the Mukden incident and its aftermath.
It really brings it all into focus. It shows how these seemingly contained regional events can just cascade, setting off world-altering consequences.
Exactly.
Okay, here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. Building on everything we've unpacked from the sources today, what does this deep dive into the Mukden incident, that Liu Jiaohu's spark, and the creation of Manchukuo really tell us about the fundamental fragility of civilian control over the military, especially when that military is driven by a potent mix of ideology and perceived national crisis?
Yeah, and maybe also what can we learn about the challenges, the inherent limitations faced by international bodies like the League of Nations when they try to maintain peace and uphold sovereignty against unilateral actions, especially actions fueled by intense nationalist fervor and severe economic pressure.
Definitely something to consider as you process this pivotal and ultimately tragic moment in 20th century history.